Hello, welcome everybody. Welcome to this live interview. I'm Stan Bertolo, the host of Back in America, a podcast that explores Americans' identity, culture, and value. So this is the second interview on the topic of guns. As always, this interview will be edited into a live podcast available on Back in America. My guest will join us a minute to discuss a heated subject, gun in America. I went to school in the US, in Maryland, and a few weeks ago, a good friend of mine from college visited us for the weekend. At night, we were joined by a couple living next door, and we started talking about politics as we downed beer by the pit fire in the backyard. Picture this. You had two French friends, my wife and I, and three Americans. I can't remember exactly how or why my old friend started to speak of guns' rights, but the conversation became intense when he said that not only did he support the right to bear arms, but that it was essential to the protection of civilians against the tyranny of the government. This made me dig further into the gun debate. I've learned that many support the idea of owning guns, any types of gun, and that in the US, some people even believe that they have a God-given right to carry a gun. This was the topic of a live interview I had yesterday with David Tribe, a Christian and gun rights activist. How can democracy work when its citizens trust their gun more than their vote? To help us answer this question and to better understand why in 2020 some Americans still think that the Second Amendment should be taken in this context, I am delighted to welcome Professor Robert Spitzer, Professor Robert Spitzer. Sorry for butchering your name.
Okay.
So welcome on Back in America, Robert. You are a distinguished service professor and the chair of the political science department at the State University of New York, College at Cortland. You are the author of 15 books. You are an expert on the US Constitution. You have testified before Congress on several occasions, and you are often quoted and interviewed by American and international news outlets. It's an honor to have you on Back in America.
Good to be with you.
So when was the last time you shot a gun?
The last time, well, let me preface this by saying that I would not consider handling and firing firearms as a prerequisite for studying gun policy in America. Having said that, the last time I fired a gun was in 2014.
Okay, that's a while back, huh? And I read somewhere that you're a member of the NRA.
I am indeed, and I've been a member for 25 years. I'm also a member of the Brady Coalition, which is a pro-gun control group, and I've been a member of that group for 25 years as well.
Okay. Now, is the NRA is not really pro-gun control, is it?
It's not, although the history of the relationship between the NRA and gun laws is a little more complicated than people might think. These days, you pretty much assume that the NRA and its message is synonymous with no gun laws, and that's close to being true. But in its history, it has supported stronger gun laws, and in fact, it has, in prior decades, helped to write gun laws going back as far as the 1930s. And even in recent years, it has lent its support to some limited gun measures, although it's not something that they like to draw a lot of attention to. But by and large, they oppose gun laws.
They do, right? Okay. And what about you? I mean, you are pro-gun, are you?
Well, I'm not pro-gun or anti-gun. I mean, my first purpose as an academic is to study the gun issue from many different points of view, from law, history, politics, of course, policy, criminology, the U.S. Constitution. And so the study of the subject is what animates me and the things that I write and speak about pretty often. I will say this, that I think anybody who owns a gun who does not have a healthy respect for a gun probably shouldn't own a gun, because any responsible gun owner knows that a gun is dangerous. And as soon as you pick it up, you open up the door to accidents, to mishandling, to loss of a firearm. People lose guns, have them stolen. I mean, a lot of bad things can happen that are not intentional on the part of the gun owner. So anybody who owns a gun needs, and I have no doubt has, healthy respect for firearms. That doesn't mean fear, but it means care.
And so, do you own a gun?
I do not, although I do have a concealed carry pistol permit that I obtained here in New York State a few years ago, and I actually wrote up about that process in a book that was published a few years ago.
Okay. Owning a gun in New York is pretty tough, right?
It is compared to most other states. It certainly is not that complicated. One of the reasons I went through the process of getting a license was to see how long the process took, how complicated it was, how onerous. And it took me, about 3 months in all from beginning to end to get my permit. They do a background check. They fingerprint you. You have to submit a photograph. They ask for references from 4 people that you know, character references, and they ask them a bunch of questions that they answer on a questionnaire. And to me, these are good steps to take precisely because they are pretty effective at filtering out people who shouldn't have a gun in the first place.
That's interesting, and we are going to come back to that. So before we go any further, could you read or recite the sentence of the Second Amendment?
Sure. The Second Amendment says the following. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And I'm not reading from any text, by the way. That's from memory.
Yeah, I can see that. And you know, that the first question that comes to mind is, what is the militia in this context? Is it a state army? Is it civilian organized into an armed group? What is it, do you think?
That's a very important question. And it even now doesn't receive the attention that it should, because the first half of the sentence is all about militias. And sometimes in the contemporary era, people scratch their head and wonder, well, what's that all about and who does that refer to? But we know exactly what it means and what it refers to. It refers to an organized body of military age eligible men, historically defined as men roughly between the ages of 18 and 45, who are called into service by the government. It could be state government, it could be the national government, but the whole definition of a militia is that it is a government organized, regulated, funded activity. Now, there are lots of people, and they've gotten quite a bit of attention in recent months, who on their own organize what they call a militia, who organize themselves, who get firearms, who sometimes have uniforms or do other things to imitate military rank and order, but they're doing it on their own. And that's not a militia. Now, they can call themselves a militia, but that doesn't make them a militia. I mean, I can call myself the King of Prussia, but that doesn't make me the King of Prussia. I mean, I can say that, right? I can say lots of things. And in fact, every state of the Union has laws against paramilitary, private, so-called military activity. And in fact, there are court cases, a very important one, back in the 1800s, that established and made very clear that there is no such right to organize a private militia. And this goes directly to why the Second Amendment was added to the Constitution. It was added to the Constitution in 1789 as one of the Bill of Rights in order to make sure that the right of citizens to obtain firearms for military service was not impeded. Because, of course, one of the things the British did back in the 1700s during the Revolutionary era was that it would strip firearms from men who they thought were suspicious or might use the guns against the British Army before and during the Revolution. And this came at a time when the government did not provide weaponry to the militias. Sorry, excuse me. Okay.
You're a busy man.
My apologies.
That's all right.
I didn't want the ringing to disturb. So as a matter of fact, by law in the 1600s and 1700s and early 1800s, military-age men were required to obtain at their own expense military-grade weaponry in case they should be called up for militia service, because the militia was the main bulwark of our military forces. Now, there was an implementation problem back then, which was that most men didn't abide by these laws because they couldn't be bothered. They didn't have the money. They had other concerns. They didn't want to serve in the militias. And the old militia system basically died out because it was a terrible way to have a national military for military purposes. But that's what the Second Amendment was all about. It was only in the year 2008 when the Supreme Court of the United States decided that the Second Amendment now referred to what's called an individual right, the right of average civilians to obtain firearms for personal self-protection in the home, that it now applied to that realm. And while the court has a right to reinterpret the law and the Constitution, they cannot reinterpret or rewrite history. And their interpretation from 2008 has nothing to do with what the Second Amendment meant by the people who wrote it and the courts that interpreted it in the intervening time.
Interesting. And I wonder if a lot of people realize that. But again, before we go there, last week, Judge Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation brought back the discussion about the Second Amendment. And I've read that Barrett said the appeal court treats the Second Amendment as a second-class right. What do you think, in a few words, before we go any further, what do you think she's talking about here? And what is the debate? When we talk about the gun debate, what debate are we talking about?
Well, her reference to the Second Amendment being treated as a second-class right is, as far as I'm concerned, it's false. It's not true. What she's referring to, and she's using a sentence that Justice Clarence Thomas wrote in a dissenting opinion in a court decision a few years ago. And she's referring to the belief by some that court rulings in the last 10 years or so have not been strict enough in broadening the definition of individual gun rights, because there have been many hundreds of court challenges of gun laws since 2008, the District of Columbia versus Heller decision that defined the Second Amendment as an individual or personal right. So hundreds of challenges of federal and state and local gun laws, but most of those gun laws have been upheld based on the criteria that the Supreme Court itself laid out back in 2008. And some in the legal community, some conservatives, are not happy with that outcome, even though I think it found a fair balance between gun laws and gun rights. But these people who are unhappy with this, Justice Thomas is one, and Judge Barrett, soon to join the Supreme Court, is another. What they're clamoring for is an expansion of gun rights that would allow and require courts to start striking down gun laws, even though there's lots of evidence that existing gun laws are beneficial and that most Americans support them and that they have withstood constitutional muster up until now.
Yeah, indeed. I read that the majority of Americans nowadays support gun laws. I think it's 60% of Americans in 2020 support gun laws against 52% in 2017. So that's indeed interesting. Well, Professor, last night I interviewed David Tribe, a Christian and guns rights activist, as I said in the introduction, and I would like to play 1-minute clips of the interviews I had with him, and to see how you can react to what he says.
Firearms are a means, in fact, they are the last means to defend two things that are important to me: life and liberty. And without firearms, you are hamstrung in your ability to defend either or both of those. And so the more I see efforts of people to restrict gun rights, the more it becomes imperative to me, not just for the sake of a right, but for the sake of preserving life and preserving liberty. I fear that if the Second Amendment is infringed enough, we'll lose our liberty for sure, and then we'll be vulnerable to whoever it is that comes down the street and wants to take our life as well.
So you personally would be ready to take arms if the left become violent.
I want to kind of phrase it generically because, I want to be careful what I say, but I'm going to do whatever I have to do to defend the Constitution of the United States.
What do you think?
Well, it's a sentiment that you certainly hear, that a segment of Americans believe in quite strongly, but there are a number of problems with this position. I mean, one problem is to defend liberty in the abstract is, of course, something that America proclaims as one of its most important purposes. But the way we do that in America is through the rule of law. It is through our legal system, the political process, that we air our grievances, that we express our points of view. The whole idea of having a constitution is that you do not resort to violence and do not have to resort to violence. Now, the further idea that somehow our government may become tyrannical and, impose martial law or impose some kind of genuine tyranny, and the idea that the random armed civilians could somehow have an effect on that beggars the imagination. How exactly would that work? And what actions would that involve? I mean, he was talking a little bit about defending yourself. And of course, on a personal level, if somebody attacks you, you have a right to defend yourself. And that could involve a gun. But when we're talking about the society and the government, the whole idea of government in a democratic system is that you don't resort to violence. And this is where people often misunderstand our revolutionary tradition, because yes, men organized and fought the British, which was the ruling government, but they did so not on their own, but they did so on behalf of a new and different government, our own government. Well, we have that government now. It was established and created first in the Articles of Confederation, our first constitution in the 1770s, and then the modern constitution that was adopted and put into place in 1789. And the idea that American civilians having guns somehow is a bulwark against tyranny, I think really is an upside down view. I worry, frankly, more about Americans with guns who decide that they're going to try and do something that they think is right, that in fact hurts people and that takes other people's liberties away rather than protecting liberty.
Right. Well, so David Tribe, and many conservators, such as Texas State Representative Matt Schaefer, wrote on Twitter last year in the aftermath of the West Texas shootings spree that he wouldn't use the evil acts of a handful of people to diminish the God-given right of my fellow Texan. So that really made me think, this idea of God-given rights. Do you think that using the Declaration of Independence preamble, that all men are endowed by their creator certain unalienable rights, and quoting the Bible is a little bit too convenient for gun defenders?
Well, the legitimate part of that reference to the Declaration of Independence has something to do with what's generally called natural rights, the idea that people have innate rights aside and apart from the rights that governments and constitutions define and protect. And you could have an argument and bring in Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, if you like, and talk about the doctrine of natural rights. But in a functioning political system, we define our rights and the government that governs all of us through the Constitution. And, to invoke the Bible specifically as somehow connected to the right to have guns, it's a head scratcher to me. I mean, I do not know how the teachings of Jesus pertain in any particular way to getting guns and threatening people with violence. I mean, it seems to me that's pretty well the opposite of anything that you could identify in the teachings of Jesus. So people call it God-given rights. I don't know. Does that mean that atheists don't have a right to have guns or protect themselves? So I'm not sure I understand that calculus, or people who subscribe to other religions. I mean, if America means everything, it means lots of different points of view. And I don't think it makes sense to hang gun rights and owning a gun on God or the Bible. To me, that just doesn't make any sense.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. So we could talk about guns for forever, and I would like to revert to my initial question, and I think you touched on that honestly already during this interview. But how can this country, how can democracy function when people trust their gun more than their vote?
Well, that is a fair description of a crisis of democracy, because, as I did suggest earlier, the whole idea of a democratic system is that you rely on peaceful democratic means to achieve your political ends, whatever they may be. And the very idea of people, for example, bringing guns, aside from the police, civilians, people bringing guns to a polling place or on election day, is not only a threat to a peaceful political process, but it is a practice that was strongly frowned upon by our forebears. And in fact, I wrote an article a month or so ago that described old gun laws. And we had laws in America that barred people from bringing guns to polling places as early as the 1770s. So even in the late 1700s and 1800s, Americans realized that carrying firearms or threatening violence at or around an election was against a peaceful electoral process. And we did have violence and gun violence at times around election time in places around America. In the 1840s, 1850s, there were some pitched gun battles between supporters of the two prevailing political parties at the time in a couple of cities. But that was not the norm, and it was widely understood that that was not what you wanted to do. That was not how you wanted to run a political system.
Right. So coming back to that pit fire, drinking beer with my friends, when he said that it's very important to have access to gun in order to protect ourselves against the tyranny of the government. I'm still not 100% sure what you, Robert Spitzer, make of that.
Well, what I make of it is that at the least, I don't understand it, and at the most, I do understand it, but find it a fantasy, simply because the American government possesses and controls a huge military establishment. The United States has the largest military of any nation in the world by far. It's larger than the military of the next 8 or 10 nations of the world combined. The counts vary depending on, how you make that comparison. So we have a huge military. The people of America want America to have a large military. Now, maybe we shouldn't have such a large military in time of peace. We face small bore conflicts, but certainly nothing that requires over 1 million people as part of the military. In most of our history, after we fought a war, the Civil War, Spanish-American War, World War I, we demilitarized. We greatly reduced the size of the American military establishment. It was only after World War II that America maintained a large standing military force. Maybe if that is indeed the threat, maybe we should simply reduce the size of the American military. It doesn't need to be as big as it is. We could always mobilize it to a greater degree if we faced a threat that required a large military force. But the thing is, in American history, we have one outstanding feature, which is that the military has historically been kept under the control of civilian authorities, something that has not been true in French history, that's not been true in the history of many other nations, and it's been one of the most important achievements of the American system, that the American military has never staged a military coup to overthrow the government, and that it has retained its identity as being under the control of civilian authorities. It's one of our most important accomplishments, and one that I think the founders would be most pleased about if they could look at us today.
Right. All right. Okay. So we are getting to the end of this interview. I've got a burning question before my last two questions, which is, Do you, like David Tribe, fear that the election might become violent?
There's been a lot of writing about this, and I've written something about it. It worries me some, but I honestly don't think we're going to have a serious problem for several reasons. One is because the number of people who are actually willing to pick up a gun or go to a polling place and actually threaten people, I think is pretty small. Secondly, we have a well-established law enforcement community in the United States. If it was me and I went to vote on election day and there's some group of people who are threatening others, I'd call the police immediately. And I would expect them to show up and to help me out. And I think that's true virtually everywhere in America. I think Americans don't really have any stomach for it or any tolerance for any real intimidation or display of arms, which is illegal virtually everywhere in America during election time. And I think we'll be okay. I wouldn't, I'd hate to make a blanket assurance about that. I have some concern, but I think we'll be okay.
Okay, good. So finally, Robert Spitzer, what is America to you?
Well, it's a lot of things, and I consider myself a patriot. But I'll use a quote that that my dissertation professor, guiding professor, used to repeat, which is that things must change if they are to remain the same. And to me, that's kind of America in many ways. The thing that makes America great is that it's always changing, that there's something always different, that it's always moving. It keeps and should keep its roots in the past, like the Constitution, what the Constitution really says, not what people pretend it says, by the way. But to me, that is what makes America great, and that's what will keep America, what will save this nation in the future, as long as it kind of functions in that way.
Thank you. And finally, for our listeners, do you have any books or movie that you think people should read or watch?
Well, there's a wonderful new book called The Politics of Gun Control that's just come out in its 8th edition. There's my commercial announcement. That aside, I read a lot and I love movies. There's so much to choose from. I'll just mention two movies that have been on my mind. Two of my favorites are Casablanca, the Humphrey Bogart movie from the 1940s, and Bridget Jones' Diary, much more recent, very different kind of movie. They're two movies that I really love watching.
Okay, good. Robert, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for this fascinating discussion and the light you put on this complex topic. Thank you.
Sure. Good to be with you.